Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Victoria's 30-year infrastructure strategy. I'm Eloise, Director of Research and Policy, and this morning I have with me Infrastructure Victoria's CEO, Jonathan Spear. Say hi, Jonathan.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
And also Infrastructure Victoria's Deputy CEO, Jill Riseley.
Morning, everyone.
So wherever you're joining us from, let's begin by recognising Victoria's strong and proud Aboriginal history. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we're joining on from today. For my colleagues and I at Infrastructure Victoria's office, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. I'd invite you all to take a moment to reflect on the country or countries that you live, work, learn and play on, and the communities who've cared for that land for tens of thousands of years. So Infrastructure Victoria is the state's independent advisory body, and we have three functions. Firstly, we produce the 30-year infrastructure strategy around every 3 to 5 years. Secondly, we provide the Victorian government with independent advice on infrastructure matters. And third, we conduct research on key infrastructure issues. This year actually marks our 10th anniversary, and you can explore our full library of research on our website. So today's webinar is an opportunity to share with you the final recommendations of the 2025 strategy update and also take your questions. So before we begin, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. You'll first hear a presentation on the final strategy from Jill and Jonathan, and that will be followed by a live panel discussion of audience Q&A. Under the live stream on our website, you'll find the links to Slido to submit questions, and there's also a link to view this webinar with closed captions. And later, that's where you'll find a feedback survey that we'd love you to fill out, but please wait till the end of the webinar. So with that, over to you, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you, Eloise. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Very excited to be talking to you all today about the final version of the 2025 update of Victoria's infrastructure strategy. So before we get stuck into talking about all of the recommendations, what we'll do is give you a sense of some of the backgrounds. We're going to talk about some of the timelines and some of the context about the key themes that the strategy picks up on and the key objectives. Then Jill and I will take you through some of the detail of the recommendations. So let's start by looking at the timelines. So just a reminder that this is the third time we have updated Victoria's infrastructure strategy. We did the first one in 2016, then in 2021. In March of this year, we released a draft version of the 2025 version of the strategy, and that was out for consultation for a couple of months. And thank you to any of you who are joining us today. If you're involved in any of the consultations or made a submission to us, we really very much appreciated that. Then last week, the final version of the strategy was tabled in Parliament and published by Infrastructure Victoria. We update the strategy every few years for a couple of reasons. The first is the world changes, and as the world changes and Victoria's context and needs change, we need to adjust our strategy. While it's a long-term strategy, we're also focused on what are the shorter-term actions that government needs to take to set us up well in the long run. So that's one of the reasons we update the strategy. The other is, in many instances, the recommendations we've made in previous strategies get implemented by the government. And so we've looked back this time around at the strategy recommendations from 2021, and over 80% of those recommendations have now been complete or are underway currently. So we're really pleased to see that, and we've taken that into account in making the recommendations for this new version of the strategy. So, to give you an overview of the strategy that we've released for 2025, it has 45 recommendations to the Victorian Government. These recommendations focus on the highest priority actions that we recommend be commenced in the next 5 years. And if the Victorian Government commences action on these in the next 5 years, it's going to set us up really well for the next 30 years. The other thing we've introduced in this iteration of a strategy is the concept of future options. And we've identified 8 future options in the strategy, and Ju and I will take you through those later on. What these are is things that we think are likely to be needed over the next 30 years, but they don't necessarily require immediate action by the government right now. And unlike the recommendations that the government is legally required to respond to, the future options are not things government needs to make its mind up about now, but they're things that we think should be well and truly on the table. Now, this strategy has been informed by lots of input from Victorian stakeholders and members of the community, and we had a couple of months of consultation from March to April of this year where there were briefings and workshops, and we also received over 300 submissions from individuals and organisations. And thanks again for any of you who were joining us who went to the effort of doing that. We very much appreciated it. We had over 2,500 individual points of feedback that we received through all of that consultation. And every single one of the recommendations that we made in the final version has been had some sort of tweak or change made to it, some bigger than others. And that is down to the really high quality of submissions and engagement that we had with many people. It also led to 2 new recommendations being inserted in the final version of the strategy and 1 new future option. So we will come to that as we go through the detail of the recommendations. Now, infrastructure doesn't exist just for itself. It exists for a purpose. And the strategy has been designed around achievement of important objectives for the state. And these are objectives that we conducted a lot of consultation on with community members a couple of years ago. And they're things that are probably dear to many of our hearts, right? So it's like Victorians having good access to housing, jobs, services and opportunities. Turning to the economy, we want to have a high productivity and circular economy. We want to make sure that Victoria is resilient to climate change and other sort of future risks that we're facing. We want to make sure that Victoria has a thriving natural environment and that we're healthy and safe. And importantly, this version of a strategy for the first time has an objective related to First Peoples. And it is engaging with the role that infrastructure can have in promoting self-determination and equal outcomes for First Peoples like other Victorians. So as you and I take you through the recommendations, you'll see that the strategy is structured along the lines of these objectives. The other thing I think to keep in mind is that this is a statewide strategy where we have sought to address the most important issues for Victorians and to identify, bring evidence and put form the biggest opportunities and priorities there are in each infrastructure sector. The strategy doesn't seek to get to every single issue in Victoria that's infrastructure related. We're seeking through this strategy to be, as the name says, strategic. What are the highest priority opportunities or problems that we need to be addressing that the Victorian government can take action through its policies or its projects or its reforms to really address and progress. And the strategy is seeking to give advice beyond existing commitments and investments. So we are not the Auditor General. We don't look back. We're not marking the government on its performance. What this strategy is about is identifying what we should be doing looking forward. And so for some of you who are wondering, well, why are some things in the strategy and why are some things not? That at least in part is an explanation, as well as us having quite a high threshold for the level of evidence that we need to have underpinning a recommendation and pretty good sense of confidence that if it's implemented by the Victorian government, it will make a difference to the world. I think the other thing that we've had an eye to is that while the Victorian government is the primary audience of this recommendations that we're making, of course it has relevance to local governments. Much of the infrastructure that we talk about has a crossover with local government and also with Commonwealth government, not-for-profit and private sector players as well. And what we do in the strategy is identify where there are roles for those organisations too. The other thing you'll see when you open up the strategy at the front end of it is we've sought to really tell the story about what are the biggest challenges that Victoria faces in achieving those objectives that we've laid out for the strategy. And there's four main challenges. The first one is that infrastructure is vulnerable to climate change, but also has a role in mitigating climate change. So Victoria will need infrastructure to support the transition to more renewable energy. But at the same time, we've got much infrastructure that wasn't built for the more frequent and severe weather events we're starting to experience. We've got a growing population and that places demand on infrastructure. So it's really important that we catch up and keep up with the infrastructure needs in our growing communities and that our investments are well planned and efficient and targeted. And that's something where we've had to make some hard choices in the strategy recommendations about, what do we think the sequence and the timing should be about where government investment is to help with the meeting of the infrastructure demands of growing communities. One of the ways, the most powerful tools that we have is the intersection between land use planning and housing and infrastructure planning. And if you're a long-time follower of Infrastructure Victoria's work, you'll know we've had quite a lot to say about that in recent years, and the strategy draws through those opportunities as well. That if we can provide more housing choices, if we can have more housing in established areas as well as greenfield areas in Melbourne and our regional cities, That gives more housing choice, it gives us some better outcomes and makes better use of the infrastructure we already have. And last but not least, governments can only build so much infrastructure. And we'll come later on to talk about the costs of the strategy. But we're obviously facing fiscal constraints and constraints in the market too about capacity to bring the skills and materials to deliver new infrastructure. So much of the recommendations we have in the strategy are about making better use of the infrastructure we have, of changes to policies and pricing and process and maintenance, things like that, to improve how we use our existing infrastructure, as well as some recommendations about the highest priority new infrastructure we need to build. So those are the key themes that run through the strategy. Now it's time to start to get stuck into each of these individual objectives and the recommendations we're making. And so I'm going to hand over to Jill to talk us through the first of those objectives and recommendations. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Jonathan. And a reminder that all our technical reports and the evidence underpinning our recommendations can be found on our website. We have a really impressive digital site this year, which enables you to look by topic area. So really encourage you to take a deep dive into that. So let's start with our first objective. Victorians have good access to housing, jobs, services and opportunities. This is a substantial segment of our strategy with 14 recommendations and 3 options. Let's start from the top with one of our largest recommendations. Recommendation 1 is to build more social homes. This is a 15-year program to build 60,000 new social homes. In Victoria, social housing only makes up 2.8% of homes compared to the national average of 4%, and Victoria has the lowest percentage of any state or territory. So this recommendation calls for a long-term pipeline of building to get us up to that national average. Over 55,000 households were on the waiting list for social housing as at March this year. This is also one of our most capital-intensive recommendations. We estimate that 60,000 new homes will cost between $12 billion and $19.5 billion over 15 years. Many of you may have seen our Learning for Life report, which was part of our social infrastructure series and looked at kindergarten, school and TAFE infrastructure. The next 3 recommendations build on this foundation of research, which of course is also available on our website. Recommendation 2 calls on the Victorian Government to facilitate markets for private and not-for-profit investment in kindergarten infrastructure. The government has made significant commitments to offer free kindergarten to 3 and 4-year-olds. We need more kindergarten places to enable this, and we estimate that Victoria will need around 900 new kindergartens by 2036. So to enable and facilitate the delivery of more kindergartens, we recommend the Victorian Government publish clear priorities for kindergarten investment over the next 5 years. And this includes deciding which school sites will host government-funded kindergartens to avoid duplicating existing or planned facilities. And the government should also regularly share updated information about the supply and demand of kindergarten places, and that will enable the private and not-for-profit sectors to invest in kindergarten infrastructure with more certainty. Now we come to schools. The Victorian Government has almost completed its 2018 promise to open 100 new schools by 2026. As Victoria continues to grow, we'll need more schools and more student places. And there are different ways which we can grow school places, and we've modelled different scenarios. Our research found that Victoria will need between 35 and 60 new schools by 2036, which is just 10 years away. Our recommendation is the government should plan, fund and buy land for new schools now. It can also consider co-locating kindergartens and early intervention services on school sites, as I've just mentioned. It should also identify and fund schools to expand and minimise costs by expanding capacity of existing schools and building larger schools. We also recommend further investment in TAFEs. Recommendation number 4 it relates to TAFE infrastructure. We estimate that there will be 1.4 million new workers needed in Victoria by 2034, and almost half will require vocational training. Many people living in Melbourne's growth areas and regional Victoria cannot easily reach a TAFE campus. Public transport services do not stop near TAFE in many regional areas. We address this in recommendation 13, which I'll get to in a minute. But teaching more students need more classroom space. In fact, we estimate TAFEs will need about 20% more space to meet expected enrolments. So what we're calling on is the government to increase the square meterage of TAFEs in Melbourne's growth areas, as well as some of our regional locations, Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo and the Latrobe Valley. This space will be really important to train more students to fill some of those key skills gaps, especially in construction, energy and health. Recommendation 5 highlights the need for new libraries and aquatic centres in Melbourne growth areas. Access to these facilities differs greatly if you live in a growth area or an established area. For example, there's one library for every 62,000 people in growth areas, as opposed to one for every 30,000 in established areas. And for aquatic centres, there is one for every 82,000 people in growth areas versus one for every 58,000 person in established areas. So we recommend the government fund councils to plan and build new centres in all 7 growth area councils. The government should fund planning for each council and then pay up to 1/3 of the cost, with local and federal governments to cover the capital costs. We also recommend the Victorian government makes government infrastructure more accessible. Part of this is ensuring that our public transport is accessible. That's really important, and the need for this is clear. 1 in 5 Victorians with a disability need help or have difficulty using public transport. 1 in 8 can't use public transport at all. We had a deadline in 2022 to make all public transport stops accessible, and we've missed this. So the benefits are really clear on the need to deliver accessibility in public transport. 26% of Victorians with a disability also have difficulty accessing buildings or facilities. We recommend that the government provide accessibility information so that people can plan and make decisions on how they travel, and that the government also updates this information as upgrades are made. On to our next slide. Our research in choosing Victoria's future found that Victorians will be better off in more compact cities. Compact cities use less land and make better use of infrastructure. The Victorian government has local government housing targets set for 70% of new homes to be in established suburbs. To enable this, we recommend the government work with local councils to plan and guide rezoning and change relevant planning schemes around public transport and open spaces. We have 2 future options here also. Options, as Jonathan mentioned, are not formal recommendations, but things that we think are worth serious consideration. The first is around making homes, affordable homes near existing infrastructure. And we suggest that the government consider mechanisms to make new homes more affordable for low-income households. And this builds on recommendation 7, which is around new homes close to public transport and services. The second option is to consider a phase out of residential stamp duties and to phase in a residential land tax. We know stamp duties discourage people from moving house as their life changes, but we also understand that stamp duty is a major source of government revenue. So moving away from stamp duty to land tax needs to be carefully phased over the long term to avoid disruptions to both revenue and the housing markets. On to trams with recommendation 8. Here we recommend increasing services on key tram routes and extending trams in Melbourne's established suburbs to support new housing. We're proposing 8 tram extensions for the government to start building by 2030. We did new research and modelling, which showed extending these tram routes would deliver significant social, environmental and economic benefits. We propose 2 routes in Arden, 2 in Fisherman's Bend and 4 in middle suburbs, Chadstone, Moorabbin, Coburg and Burwood East. We've also made a number of recommendations around buses. Many Melbourne and regional bus services haven't changed since they began. We recommend running buses more often and services to be upgraded so that by 2030, 80% of people in Melbourne, Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo live within 800 metres of a public transport service that arrives at least every 20 minutes. Running buses more often delivers similar benefits to some of our big road or rail projects, but at far lower cost. We also know from our previous research that if buses are reliable and frequent, then people will use them. We also recommend a new bus rapid transit network in Melbourne. I always have trouble saying that, starting with routes that connect with train stations and busy destinations. Bus rapid transit networks offer an alternative to travelling by car. They provide a fast and more frequent service than Melbourne's existing bus network, as they use larger buses that run along dedicated and separated lanes. We've prioritised 6 routes to progress by the early 2030s, 5 new routes, and also we recommend extending the eastern busway along Hoddle Street. We've also recommended a number of ways for our train network to serve more people, in particular those in Melbourne's west and north where it's most needed. Recommendation 11 extends the metropolitan train network to Melton and expands the network to allow for faster Geelong, Ballarat and Wyndham Vale V-Line services. Specifically, this would build 2 more tracks from Sunshine to Caroline Springs and new train stations at Thornhill Park and Mount Atkinson. The V-Line trains that currently serve on the Melton line can be redeployed to other areas of Melbourne's west and regional Victoria. This recommendation would also deliver a new train station at Altona North and again rezoning the land around that for increased housing. Our modelling suggests that electrifying the Melton line delivers significant benefits of up to $1.70 for every dollar invested. We've also looked at a new recommendation for train infrastructure and to run more services in Melbourne's north. We've completed some further modelling here and received significant feedback. So as you might be aware, this is a new recommendation. Currently, the rail infrastructure restricts how many trains can run at once on the Upfield line. We've recommended duplicating the single track sections of the Upfield line and upgrade power and signalling so we can deliver more services. Doing this would allow trains to travel in both directions so more services can run. This would allow up to 9 Upfield line trains to run each hour instead of 4. And again, we've done a number of really significant modelling and suggest the rezoning of land around these stations. We've also recommended 2 new stations here, one at Campbellfield as well as one at Beveridge on the Seymour line. One of the options that we received a significant amount of feedback on was around extending metropolitan lines to growth areas in Melbourne's north and southeast, and these remain an option. Specifically extending the metropolitan train lines to Clyde and at least to Calcalo to help address the need for public transport in Melbourne's north and southeast. In recommendation 45, a little bit later on, we call on the government to complete detailed assessments of these extensions and electrifications to allow for more metropolitan train services. We're also calling for more bus and coach services in regional Victoria. We know many regional Victorians rely on cars to get around, but not everybody has one. So ensuring options and connectivity on public transport is really important. New suburbs in places like Shepparton and Wodonga have no bus services at all. So we're recommending more bus services in regional centres, specifically Shepparton, Wodonga, Mildura, Wangaratta, Horsham, Bairnsdale, Warragul and Druin. We've also suggested that we look at simplifying regional fare zones and make off-peak public transport cheaper. It's one of the really exciting things that we can do now that the government has nearly completed the upgrade of the Myki ticketing system. And I'll keep running through. I know we're going to run out of time. We've got many recommendations. On to the next objective, which is Victorians are healthy and safe. Here we make a number of recommendations, one which we received a lot of feedback from, a lot of positive feedback, which was around making local streets safer for children and communities. Part of that is recommending reducing speed limits to 30 kilometres an hour on local streets and starting in places that children visit, so schools, playgrounds and kindergartens. We've also recommended that we build safe cycling networks in Melbourne and regional cities. Now, for every dollar we invest in walking and cycling infrastructure, we receive significant benefits, health, economic and environmental benefits. So a really good opportunity to increase our infrastructure there. We're recommending the Victorian Government fund 16 priority corridors. 12 of those are in Melbourne and also corridors in Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo and Wangaratta. Many of you may have also previously heard of our research around sharing school grounds, and that would enable people to be able to walk to an outdoor sports field or sports court. We're going to need a lot more open spaces in the future, and this is a recommendation that was really well received previously, and we know that the government has already started piloting this, which is fantastic. We've also made a number of health recommendations. One is to invest in the maintenance, upgrades and expansions of community health facilities. We know how important community health facilities are. We released a report earlier this year into the state of community health facilities and the importance in investing in that, particularly as a really cost-effective way of ensuring that people with complex health needs better manage their health. We've also called on the government to build more residential alcohol and other drug treatment facilities. We've seen wait lists increase by 40% since the pandemic for drug and alcohol treatment, and particularly in some of those regional areas. We've also recommended further investment in digital healthcare. We know that digital technology can make hospital infrastructure work more effectively, and we've seen this really successfully rolled out in many areas across Victoria. So we think that that's a great investment and we should continue to do that. One of our significant recommendations is around the redevelopment of the Alfred, the Austin and the Royal Melbourne hospitals. We know how important these tertiary hospitals are. For example, the Alfred is Australia's largest trauma centre and treats over half of all major Victorian trauma cases. It's got the 24/7 helipad. The Royal Melbourne is one of the state's busiest emergency department and provides specialised care in neurosciences and stroke services. So those tertiary hospitals are really important. Some of those facilities are now aged facilities. So we're calling on the government to redevelop those 3 hospitals, starting all 3 in the next 5 years and completing them all within the next 10 years. We've also made 2 specific recommendations on infrastructure for First Peoples. Firstly, around housing. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have less secure housing and lower rates of home ownership than other Australians. Around 10% of Aboriginal households own their home outright compared to 30% of all Australians. 1/3 of Aboriginal people live in social housing compared with 3% of all Australians. So we're recommending the government fund a 10-year program to build social homes for First Peoples and provide secure and sustainable tenancies. In 2024, Victorian First Peoples were also more likely to be hospitalised for preventable diseases than non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Infrastructure Victoria was really proud this year to release our report, which we jointly developed with the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, VACCHO. Part of that was recommending that the Victorian Government fund and start health and wellbeing infrastructure projects identified by Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisations, ACCOs, and ensure that that additional funding will enable ACCOs to build more infrastructure and fund infrastructure to maintain those services. We know the ACCO model delivers really good wellbeing outcomes, and I'd encourage people to read more about this recommendation and our joint report with VACCHO. Jonathan, that's a whistle-stop tour of some of our first recommendations, and I'll hand over to you to take us through.
Great, thank you very much, Jill. So now I'm going to talk about the next one of our objectives, which is that Victoria have a thriving natural environment. And so we've got a range of recommendations here. One is around the importance of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that we have either enabled from infrastructure or embedded in the infrastructure. So we're making recommendations around the government counting the carbon that goes into our infrastructure projects and seeking to reduce that over time, working with our infrastructure delivery partners. On the water sector, there's a couple of important components to the way in which we can have that sector really performing well. One is to continue the investments that are being made in integrated water management. So this is making sure that every drop of water that we have is reused and recycled where we can, instead of it going to waste. A component of that is that we should be seeking to maximise the opportunity for every source of water being on the table. We already use recycled water in lots of different ways in Victoria. One of the things we're calling for in this recommendation is to pilot a recycled drinking water plant to prove up the economics and the safety, and for the public to actually have a better sense of what recycled drinking water is. It happens in lots of other cities around the world. We think it is an important step towards determining whether it is one of the options that we should implement in Victoria. Then we have a future option, which we need to plan for, more manufactured water in Victoria. Many of you are probably aware that we have a desalination plant already in Victoria. Projections that we and others are making into the future indicate that we're likely to need an additional manufactured water capacity, either at the existing plant being expanded or a second new plant being created. Now is the time to start planning for that, so we're in a good position in the next decade to develop an additional desal plant if we need one. The other thing that our strategy recognises is the importance that open space and tree canopy cover has, and we think of this as a form of infrastructure. And so, while many private and public players have a role in delivering open space and tree canopy, we're recommending that the Victorian government open up more public land for growing communities, particularly where we're going to have more population in established areas, and make sure that some of those areas like utilities land, for example, that could be opened up, that is made available for the public to use, along with continuing to plant more trees with a target of 30% tree canopy cover. Then we move to a recommendation about Victoria being resilient to climate change and other future risks. So we've got that objective, and we have a range of recommendations around how we do that. Some of this is around the adaptation that we need to make, and some of it is the role of the Victorian government in the energy transition. So some of you might be aware that Infrastructure Victoria has done work on adaptation of infrastructure to climate change, and that's called Weathering the Storm, and you can find more detail about that on our website. But what we're identifying is that much of our infrastructure is not designed for the more frequent and severe weather events that we are experiencing. So now is the time for us to prioritise the infrastructure that's most at risk and start investing in making it more adaptable so it does not fall over in the face of extreme weather events. The other thing that we are recommending is that we have new flood maps that are informed by the latest research and modelling about where we're likely to have flooding, but also inundation in our coastal areas now and into the future, with that combination of sea level rise and more frequent and severe weather. That should then be integrated into our planning schemes, so everyone is working on the same basis about where we should and shouldn't be developing new housing and new infrastructure in future. Then we turn to a range of recommendations that we have made in relation to the energy transition and the highest priority actions for the Victorian government in that transition. Now, there are a lot of players in the energy transition at different levels of government and public and private sector players as well, and different regulators. And this is a very fast moving area. And it's certainly one where we made quite a lot of changes between the draft and the final strategy because of that pace of change and the many really valuable submissions that we received. But the focus here is the role the Victorian government has as opposed to all of those other players. So one of our recommendations is the Victorian government be very clear about what it thinks the key energy infrastructure projects are that it needs to most focus, its co-investment, but also things like delivery of roads and ports, and support of investment and planning approvals to deliver those critical path energy projects. Some of that involves improving environmental assessments and site selection for energy projects so that they are streamlined and clearer in a way that still maintains appropriate environmental protection while giving proponents and developers and communities clarity about where and how future energy projects should be delivered. When it comes to households, we're recommending continued investment in energy efficiency and electrification of households with a focus on low income and social housing, because those are the households that have much to gain from additional electrification and energy efficiency, but maybe in the least position themselves to be able to afford to do so. So we're recommending the targeting of government investment to those households. We also have a recommendation about batteries at the home, the neighbourhood, and the big battery level. Big batteries are really important as a role in giving longer duration of storage of the energy that we generate through renewables for times when we need them, when the sun's not shining or the wind isn't blowing. But also they're important to complement the transmission network as well, because the more big batteries we have, the less transmission network we need to have. We're recommending neighbourhood batteries, and just because what that does is allow the best use of the local electricity distribution network, and for more people, even those who may not have batteries, to draw on their homes, to draw from the neighbourhood batteries. And when it comes to home batteries, the Commonwealth Government, of course, is providing subsidies now for those. We're really got to focus here on low-income households being supported and encouraging participation in virtual power plant schemes. Staying with energy still, we have two other recommendations and a future option which we've added. I talked before about storage and the role of batteries in storage. There's also a need to determine long duration energy storage needs. This is one of the highest risks that our research has identified. We've had feedback from stakeholders as well. And the Victorian government needs to determine how much of its long duration energy storage is going to rely upon long distance connections from other states through the East Coast electricity network, and how much it's going to require to have that capacity in Victoria. In addition, we've changed recommendation 35 in the final version of the strategy to make it clearer that what we're talking about in this one is the synergies between electricity planning, gas planning, and renewable gas production. We're identifying the benefits of planning at a more local level about how much energy, both gas and electricity, might be generated and used at a local level, and the benefits of continuing to support renewable gases, things like biomethane, that can often be have the input material and the generation and use all within one region. And then we have a new future option. We have looked very hard and had lots of submissions around the future of the gas network. And what we identify is a risk that as more households potentially come off the gas network over time, that might mean that the viability of local gas networks for domestic use becomes less strong economically. And that could be a challenge for both the network owners, but also for households that are left on the gas network. So they need to have a clear path and a fair path in that transition. The other thing we need to plan for is having enough gas supply for production of electricity in future, where there might be gaps in what is produced by the renewables network, and continued supply for some industrial and commercial users who are unable to substitute electricity for gas. So that's what that future option is about. Let's turn to the last of the objectives then in the strategy about Victoria having a high productivity and circular economy. We are recommending that there be alignment of the planning for each of the sectors of infrastructure that the Victorian government has a strong role in. Things like transport, health, education, for example, and making sure that that planning lines up with our future planning for where we want to have our housing and our jobs. Because what our research shows is unless there's an alignment of the infrastructure and the planning, it's going to be difficult to achieve those housing and jobs and population objectives that the government set in things like Plan for Victoria and the Housing Statement. We're calling for reform of infrastructure contributions, so that they are simpler and more predictable contributions that are made by developers for the infrastructure that growing communities need, and that they cover all development settings where there's large growth in community and following infrastructure that's needed, whereas at the moment that is only in a limited number of greenfield growth areas. The Victorian government has hundreds of billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that it owns. And what our research shows is that the quality of the asset management systems that we have to understand the condition of that infrastructure and how and when it needs to be maintained could well be improved. So we're recommending investment in the asset management systems so we can make the best use of those hundreds of billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. Then we've got a couple of recommendations that are related to waste and recycling. One is that as we prepare for more recycling and waste infrastructure in future, that there be a stronger and clearer alignment between those future needs in our planning system, so that future infrastructure plans are more specific about where we need to have recycling and waste infrastructure in places that are appropriate places and don't impinge upon existing local communities too much, but also work for the industry and work economically so that they're not too far away. And then we have a new recommendation about setting future waste levy prices and auditing of landfill. We heard in lots of submissions that unless there's clarity about what the future waste levy prices are going to be, industry will find it difficult to justify investing in more recycling and resource recovery infrastructure. And if we audit the content of what's going into our landfill, we might have a better sense of how we could be doing better in terms of diverting more of that material to recycling or waste to energy opportunities. We've got a recommendation about greater use of digital technologies in government infrastructure. What this is about is taking proven existing digital technologies, things like building information management, and applying them on more government projects and in their planning and building and operation. And when it comes to our road network, we're also recommending continued rolling out of smart road management technology, both on our freeways and our arterial roads, because we've got this in some of our networks and it's working really well, but not all of the network in Melbourne and our growing regional cities. Then we come to a future option around charging people fairly to use roads. So this is the gamut of road user charging options, from things as simple as pricing of parking to distance-based charging of electric vehicles, which has been the subject of some discussion at a national level in recent years, through to area-based charging. There's a whole swathe of this that we have done a lot of work on in Infrastructure Victoria, and you can hit up our website if you want to know more. It's a future option we think needs to be on the table. Then we've got recommendations about freight. And so we're recommending greater clarity around the future rail freight network plans for how and when it is going to be upgraded, and more certainty around the maintenance of that in future years. There's a real opportunity to encourage more off-peak delivery of freight in urban areas where we're finding the productivity of the freight industry is being restricted by peak congestion. So allowing off-peak delivery would certainly be a benefit there. And in future, an option to think about is to have zones designated where delivery is done by smaller, low emission vehicles, where they can operate in areas that are otherwise quite congested. Now, Jill alluded before to recommendation number 45. This is an important recommendation. It's the last of the recommendations in the strategy, and it covers off many of the big infrastructure projects that people have often got in their minds. What we've done in this strategy is identify with quite a degree of rigour what are the projects we think need to be commenced in the next 5 years versus what are the ones we need to be planning for in the next 5 years for delivery afterwards. And that's what this recommendation is about. So we are saying that projects like the Outer Metropolitan Ring Road, Melbourne Metro 2, those northern and southeastern rail extensions that Jill was referring to before, but also Bay West Port, another desalination plant, and future hospital capacity in Melbourne's north are all things that the Victorian government should be doing the planning, the land reservation and the business cases for the next 5 years, so that they are options that we can then trigger in the next decade. One of the future options that we're particularly calling out and a bit of feature on is reconfiguration of the city loop. So we're about to open Melbourne Metro, and it's going to be quite a transformative experience for many of us. There's an opportunity to also continue to disentangle the city loop with a couple of additional tunnels, one from North Melbourne to Flagstaff and the other from Parliament to Richmond, with some other upgrades, and that would give us similar uplifts of capacity in our metro system. You can dive into the strategy where we explain all of these projects as future options in more detail. So those are the recommendations and the future options. What does all this cost, and what are the benefits of doing so? So we have done a strategic level costing of every one of our recommendations and options, and we estimate that delivering all the recommendations would cost between $65 and $75 billion to the Victorian government over the next decade. When you factor in the ability to make smart use of our land or contributions from a Commonwealth government and others, that is likely to come down to more like $60 billion. Importantly, this is an affordable and fiscally responsible strategy in that we have modelled out the cost of delivering this strategy against the government's existing commitments and its aspiration to get its capital spending on infrastructure to about $15 billion a year. And so our recommendations fall beneath that envelope of spending that the government set in this budget. Only a small proportion of the recommendations actually have this large capital costs. And Jill was mentioning some of them earlier. It's investments in social housing, schools, kinders, and some of those public transport and hospital recommendations. In exchange, we get over $160 billion of benefits as Victorians from implementing these recommendations. And with this new strategy, we're releasing new cost-benefit analysis transparently for everybody to see about the benefits of things like the Melton Rail electrification, the tram extensions and the cycling corridors that Jill was describing earlier. You can dive in and have a lot more detail on our strategy in our website, because you'll see It's intuitive, it's individualised, and it's interactive. There's maps around many of our recommendations, particularly the transport recommendations, where you can really visualise and see before and after, and get a sense of what we mean by each of these recommendations. And finally, what happens next? Well, the strategy's been tabled in Parliament. The Victorian government has 12 months to respond to it, and release its own infrastructure plan. What we would really encourage you and your organisations to do is to dive into the strategy, look at all the underpinning research, and use as a reference in your own work. But in the meantime, thank you very much for all of you who've engaged with us over this multi-year journey as we've been updating this strategy. We're going to keep on working on the most important infrastructure issues and opportunities that Victoria faces, with that independent, evidence-based and consultative method that Infrastructure Victoria uses. With that, Eloise, I'm going to hand back to you. I know we've got a little bit of time left for some questions, and so really looking forward to hearing what audience members of most want to hear about.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you, Jill, for walking everyone through an overview of our final recommendations and also touching on what went into developing them. So we'll move into our audience questions. We've had some great ones coming through, and Slido is still open. We will run a couple of minutes over time so that we can get to more of your questions. So if you do need to drop off at midday, a gentle reminder to please fill out the feedback survey. It's only got 3 questions and it should only take a minute or so. So our first question is one for you, Jill. How does the strategy balance infrastructure needs versus limiting impacts on climate change, particularly when building new infrastructure also generates emissions?
It's a good question, Eloise. We do, as Jonathan mentioned, have a recommendation around reducing the emissions of our infrastructure, but a lot of the focus with our recommendations, as you might have noticed, is around facilitating infrastructure so that people can do things like use public transport, that we can have more efficient freight, that we can have a transition to an electricity network that has us fit for purpose for the future in a low emissions economy. So it's very much is very focused on the priorities and what we really need to deliver today and over the next 5 years. But it really will set us up for a low emissions economy and reducing our impact on the environment. So I think we've managed to get the balance right there.
Thanks, Jill. Next one I might throw to you, Jonathan. Can you speak to recommendations for regional Victoria?
Yeah, absolutely. So this strategy has lots of recommendations relevant for regional Victoria, and the ones I'd particularly call out is so obviously people get really interested in transport, right? And we have a number of specific recommendations about transport. So improved bus services, improved coach services. There's a real interplay between improvements of the metropolitan rail service and freeing up pathways and carriages for the line services to regional Victoria. And we're also calling for improvements to cycling and that smart traffic management networks in regional Victoria. Then when it comes to some of the social infrastructure, that's really important. So we're pulling out the importance of investment in community health infrastructure, in the drug and alcohol rehabilitation services. Much of the digital health infrastructure improvements have a disproportionate benefit in some ways for regional Victorians because it avoids the need to travel. So there's some really big benefits there, as well as things like kindergarten and school and TAFE investments, because they are ones that really came out clearly as needs for regional Victoria. The other thing, of course, is that investments in the freight network are really important for the regional Victorian economy, and that's one of the key things we're calling out in terms of the regional rail framework and investments. And last but not least, the energy transition has a really important role in regional Victoria, because it's going to be many of the places in regional Victoria that are future renewable energy zones, where we need to have clarity and clear planning approvals and community engagement processes on the transmission and other lines being developed. So that's really important as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. And staying with that freight theme, there's a question around the need for a second major container port hitting Victoria around 2055. Given that the Port of Melbourne is currently consulting on expanding the current port and adding a fourth container terminal, what are your thoughts on recommending the new port rather than a fourth container terminal?
Well, the two are entirely consistent. And again, for those of you who are long-term Infrastructure Victoria watchers, we provided some advice some years ago on how big the Port of Melbourne should get and when and where we might need another container port. So it is entirely consistent that the Port of Melbourne is continuing to develop its capacity, and it should be supported to do so in coming years, because that's good for Victorians, it's good for the freight network, and it's good for the Victorian economy. There will come a point where the capacity of the Port of Melbourne to continue to expand will be constrained, and that is likely to be in a couple of decades' time, and that's what our prior research showed. So we should continue to plan for a future port at Bay West, which is near Werribee, and reserve the corridors for land and access to that port, because it's an important option for us to have in the future.
Thank you. This one's for you, Jill. It's around the waste levy. Could you talk to views on who should be paying this levy? Is it consumers or producers? And also what incentives might be needed to try to discourage importing poor packaging and disposal of the packaging?
Thanks, Eloise. The waste levy is paid by everyone. So for every tonne of waste that goes into the ground, a waste levy is applied. So what it is designed to do, and it does do quite successfully, is disincentivise waste. And by doing so means that we can prioritise and invest more in recycling. So it is a really important tool, and it's been a really successful tool, not just in Victoria but in other states. The issue of packaging is a really good one. The Victorian government has, over the last 5 years, made really substantial investments in recycling, in standardising not only residential bins, but also what can go into the bins, and that's really important. We're seeing increasing innovations in that space, such as soft plastics trials in municipal waste, but really understanding what goes into not just the recycling bin, but the waste bin is really important. One of our recommendations is not only around transparency of the waste levy, but also to fund an audit of the composition of what's going into landfill. And that's really important so that we understand what's going into the ground that really we should be recycling, so we can get a little bit of an understanding of the opportunity and the gap between recycling and really only putting into the ground what cannot be recycled.
Thanks, Jill. Staying with you, Jill, our next question is around a very hot topic in Victoria of late, which is building density in our suburbs. So this question is asking what methods are in place to balance the loss of ground permeability. It's asking about sending more and more rainwater as stormwater into creeks and the effect on the local groundwater table, and also impacts on local vegetation growth. What comments would you have in response to that question?
We make a number of recommendations that relate to that, Eloise. One being, well, let's start with the flood map. So really understanding the impact and the risk of flooding, and part of that is making sure that we have up-to-date data and up-to-date flood maps so that we're able to understand that risk. We also make a recommendation around open space, and open space is really important, not just for recreational and health reasons, but also for the impacts of climate and ensuring that that we have urban sponges, as we call them, so that when we have increased intensity of rainfall, that rain has somewhere to go, but also looking at the infrastructure around water. So Jonathan mentioned some of our water recommendations. That looks at a more integrated approach to water. So not just looking at wastewater and stormwater and drinking water, but an integrated management looks at just water as a whole and starts to look at the flows and the opportunities on how we use that water. Because we know with climate change, we'll see increased intensity in rainfall, but we'll also see a decrease in the amount of water we have. So managing water is going to be really important, and that's why we've got a number of recommendations in that space.
Thank you, Jill. Jonathan, back to a question on transport. It's around what recommendations are in place beyond extending the Eastern Freeway busway to the Hoddle Street busway. And it's recognising that the bottleneck in the CBD will require some upgrades along Victoria Parade and potentially the removal of the Hoddle Street hook turn and also some improvements at the CBD end. Could you talk to the bus recommendations?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. So what our modelling has shown with relation to the bus rapid transit network is that while it's great that we're going to have one down the Eastern Freeway, there's a real risk that its performance is going to get hampered quite a lot once it hits congestion close to the city. And so that's why we've identified the opportunity for a dedicated lane for bus rapid transit from the end of the Eastern Freeway into the city. What that would do is really continue to reinforce the performance and the viability of that bus rapid transit service along Hoddle Street and through the Eastern Freeway and connecting to the city. It's one of a number of bus rapid transit networks that we're recommending, and we've published on this previously in our research. What the strategy does is prioritise the ones that look to us like they're going to have the highest demand and performance and have really good returns in terms of benefits compared to their costs. This would be a game changer for Melbourne. If we do implement bus rapid transit, we would deliver, high quality, high frequency rapid transit for communities that really haven't had it before. And it does it as a fraction of the time and the cost it would take if we were to try to do that with, light or heavy rail. So it's one of the reasons why, we think it's a really exciting move that, other cities like Sydney and Brisbane and Adelaide have done, and we think it's time for Melbourne to have bus rapid transit too.
Thanks, Jonathan. And our last question before I close the session is for you, Jill. How does the strategy consider the economic benefits of attracting data centres and AI to Victoria against the environmental and resource trade-offs?
Data centres is a hot topic at the moment, Eloise. It's really interesting around looking at the potential growth and also the locations of data centres, and it's something that we have turned our mind to. Our energy recommendation does look at modelling around energy use across Victoria. I think what we will continue to see is a growth in the demand for energy, particularly with AI coming online. So balancing the location of data centres is going to be really important. Balancing the environmental impact of those data centres and making sure that they're placed really well. And we do have a number of recommendations around precincts and around zoning and where things should be located. But data centres is one of those things that making sure that they're located in the right place, making sure that from an energy grid perspective, they're integrated well and that they're positioned well, I think is really important. So it's a good question and certainly one that we'll continue to look at in the years to come.
Thanks, Jill. So everyone, that concludes today's discussion. If you'd like to look at more detail on the 2025 strategy update, including the technical reports that Jill and Jonathan mentioned and also our wider research program, please visit our website. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Jonathan and Jill for their time today, and in return we would like to thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, we would really appreciate your feedback via the Slido poll. We genuinely value your interest in our work, and we really look forward to continuing to support informed decision making on Victoria's infrastructure needs. Have a lovely day, everyone, and goodbye for now.